Welcome to the BCN and Friends podcast, where we hold interesting conversations about learning with a range of thought leaders, BCN certification holders, and industry professionals. Our goal is to create value and insight for you, our professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. We hope you find our discussions interesting, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, and always worth your time.
In this podcast episode, we want to introduce you to our BCEN friend, Graham Newton. Graham is an accomplished nurse and paramedic whose diverse career spans emergency and critical care, flight nursing, and pre-hospital medicine, from Level 1 trauma centers to medevac missions in the high Arctic. With advanced credentials in nursing and paramedicine, a passion for research and leadership, Graham brings deep expertise to the evolving field of emergency and transport care. This episode is called Lions Don't Have to Roar.
I'm Holly Briggs, a professional development specialist at BCEN and one of your hosts for today. I'm joined by my co-host, Michael Dexter, Director of Professional Development at BCEN. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Holly.
Thanks for being with us. And in this episode, we're joined by Graham Newton. Graham is a highly experienced flight nurse with the Shock Trauma Air Rescue Services in Calgary, Alberta, bringing over 20 years of expertise in emergency and critical care across hospital and pre-hospital settings. We have a lot of podcast territory to cover. So without further delay, Michael, could you please introduce us to our BCN friend, Graham?
Yeah, absolutely. Graham's career has encompassed adult and pediatric emergency departments and level 1 trauma centers, critical care, clinical education, and research. He's also worked extensively in pre-hospital settings, including medevac flights in the high Arctic, EMS, ski patrol, and disaster relief. Graham holds a Bachelor's of Nursing from University of Manitoba and a Master of Nursing from the University of Calgary, along with specialty training in critical care from Mount Royal University. He's credentialed as a certified flight nurse, certified transport nurse, and advanced care paramedic, and is currently pursuing studies to become a nurse practitioner. Beyond his clinical work, Graham serves as a board member for the College of Registered Nurses of Alberta, contributing to governance and leadership in the nursing profession. His research focuses on pre-hospital care with published peer-reviewed articles on tension pneumothorax, and a textbook chapter on cardiovascular emergencies in critical care transport. Graham, welcome to the BCN and Friends podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hey, thanks very much for having me on. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, it's great. We have a lot of things we want to dive into, and specifically in the world of flight. But can you just tell us a little bit about why you decided to become a nurse? Maybe a little about the ski patrol, because I don't think everybody's familiar with that, and how you ended up in a flight nursing role.
Yeah, absolutely. Nursing was something that for me, I didn't know that I wanted to do until I was almost knee deep in it, honestly. When I first went to university, I wasn't entirely sure which direction I was going to go, and I knew that I was interested in healthcare and where I was living at the time. The EMS system was one that really was difficult to get started into and to get educated in. It required sort of a what's the best word for it? Maybe like a tiered way of joining the system where there's really no guarantees of career progression. And for me, the sure thing was to go to university and get a degree, where at the time I knew that I would have a job to be able to come out of school and be able to join the healthcare workforce right away with. So that's kind of how I joined up in nursing. With regards to the ski patrol, that was something that I was the combination of two things that I really enjoy, healthcare and being outside and doing skiing. And I'm very fortunate that we have a group of doctors, nurses, paramedics that work for one of the ski hills on a volunteer basis here close by. And we support their local team, their pro patrollers, who are the ones that do 99% of the work, the snow safety work, all of the avalanche control. They care for the majority of the patients. And then when there's somebody that needs just that little extra little bit of care that one of us can provide, then we'll join up to supplement them. And it's a really great collaboration and allows me to enjoy being outside and doing a lot of the things that I love all at the same time. So it's really fun. With regards to flight nursing, it was also a bit of an accident that I ended up in flight nursing, truthfully. It was a thing that I started doing fixed wing to begin. And I went up to the high Arctic here. I was based out of a city called Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. And I started doing the sort of longer fixed wing type flight nursing role and going to communities that otherwise are very underserved by just the lack of road access. And so if somebody gets ill or injured, the response time is, upwards of 4 or 5, 6 hours to be able to get to some of those people. And so it's a very different type of nursing and a different type of flight nursing, honestly, than what I'm doing now. And it's kind of something that scratched the itch of adventure for me when I was starting. And I got to go and see a lot of places that most people would never otherwise have a reason to see. And it was a very gratifying job as well, being able to serve people that, really are fundamentally underserved by the healthcare system. And from there, I actually looked at going back to school, and I had joined a second undergrad program, and I was working on kind of taking people that are already well and making them even better by studying kinesiology and specifically exercise health physiology. So the idea of taking somebody who's well, like an athlete, and then sort of teasing out that extra, 5% of performance. And I wanted some connection back with the healthcare system after a little while, and I was looking for a way to volunteer. And I found through word of mouth and friends that there was an organization that was doing rotary flight nursing, or air ambulance work, I should say in general, here in Calgary. And so I went and I had a meeting with one of the people who was running the program at the time, and they kind of showed me around. And at the end of that meeting, it really became apparent that there was no role for somebody to volunteer in that kind of environment. And we went our separate ways until probably a year or so later, I got a call asking if I wanted to join and help with the beginnings of a new base that they were going to operate. And I thought, school's always going to be there, so why don't I give that a try for a year or two, and then I can go back to school. And that's now about 18 years ago that I decided to make the switch. And so now I work in a full-time clinical role on a rotary wing air ambulance, and we serve the better part of southern Alberta and into the Rocky Mountains in the interior of British Columbia here from Calgary.
Wow. While you were talking, and you mentioned it a couple of times, this is how I'm going to tie it together, but while you were talking, it reminded me of the painter Bob Ross, and he would stand in front of his paintings and he'd be like, oh, we made a little mistake here. But you know what that is? That's not a mistake. It's a happy little accident. And he would turn it into a bird or another part of the tree, something beautiful on a landscape, right? And I felt like while you were talking about, well, I didn't really mean to end up there. I'm not really sure. Like, it's just a little accident that I kind of landed where I did. That's all I could hear was just, man, that's a happy little accident, because you turned what seemed to be just an opportunity, you saying yes to something or being interested in something, and that turned into you being at a base that, again, you went there, you thought about volunteering. A year later, they're like, hey, do you want a job? And I feel like sometimes in the course of your career, when you look back over it, there's just these happy little accidents that maybe you weren't really looking for them. You kind of, the door opened and you said yes, and all of a sudden you end up where you probably always should have been. But the road in hindsight, the road looks like, man, what if I had chosen differently? Or what if I had said no? Or what if I hadn't taken the time to go and look into that opportunity a little bit more? I don't know. Like, I think sometimes people believe that like there's going to be these big moments in your career, and not to diminish that. But I think a lot of times it really is just these happy little accidents. And before you know it, it's a beautiful career for sure. So that's enough with that. I know maybe my childhood obsession with Bob Ross is showing. Who knows? But
No, I feel you. Like it definitely wasn't a straight road to get there. And one of the, I guess, like overarching tenets that like looking back on it now I see is the difference between goals and objectives, right? Goals are very broad, ill-defined things, whereas objectives are very narrow and, I will do this by this point in time, or I will achieve this given these circumstances. And one of the difficult things about having, really well-defined objectives is that what do you do if you don't meet it, if you don't make it to that objective, versus having more overarching goals where when something comes up, you have the latitude to pivot and take a bit of a detour for a little bit. And I don't know, like I feel as though I could have taken a bunch of different routes to get to where I am, but I'm certainly not disappointed that I did the things that I did to get here. Whereas the alternative to that is if you decided like right from the get-go that you had a very narrow objective in mind, and then you're struggling and you're running against friction or barriers and you're really having a difficult time to get there. Man, that can be, just from like a psychological perspective, that can be really difficult for folks.
I think the path that you took allowed you the flexibility to say yes when you could say yes, to realize that maybe it's time for me to put this down. I can pick it up later, and just to kind of move at a pace that doesn't get you that frustration point, which again, we could probably spend a lot of time on why do nurses get frustrated along their career. I feel like that, honestly, that's probably a whole podcast series itself. But to move on to just another, again, I feel like this question is going to be really broad, but a lot of times nurses are asked by colleagues and even those outside of healthcare. I'm sure you've gotten this question. I know I have, as well as Michael, to share like some of the most challenging or maybe a most memorable patient case. And given kind of the depth of your experience, I do realize like this is a pretty broad question, but I would love for you to just share with us kind of maybe a particularly impactful case from your career, or something that, you know, if I was sitting down with you and I was like, so Graham, tell me, what is that patient that really challenged you? What was that ride that it's kind of locked in your memory?
Yeah, I think this is a very common question actually. I find it's often asked as, "Hey, what was the grossest thing you've ever done?" or "What was like the scariest thing you've ever seen?" And typically people regret their choice of asking that question like immediately after they hear the answer. But for me, I have a very memorable case that is from a number of years ago during the summer, and I was working with a colleague who is equally, if not, quite a bit more experienced than I am, and he brings so much skill to the table, and he's somebody that I can really rely on for not only like clinical expertise, but real like critical thinking expertise, which is something that I'd kind of like to focus on a little bit with this case. And it's going to be anticlimactic in the end. And the spoiler is that essentially like we did nothing. And I know that that is very not very dramatic, and it's maybe a bit of a letdown, but the critical thinking piece of this case is what really makes it fascinating. And so the case was a young man who was riding a dirt bike and unfortunately hit a tree going at a fairly high rate of speed. And we weren't too far away. It was probably a 15-20 minute response to get out there to help with the helicopter. And we heard that this person was having a really difficult time breathing, and the paramedics that were with the patient were quite concerned about his chest trauma from the injury. And we didn't really have much more information than that. Such is the way in pre-hospital care. You have little snippets of information that you have to start kind of forming a bit of a mental model with and start thinking through the possibilities of what you're going to be showing up to anticipate the equipment and the medications and all the things that you need to get ready, and even sometimes going through in your head thinking about the steps of various procedures even before you get there, just to refresh your memory, and briefing with your colleagues to say, like if this, then that, who's going to be in charge of what if these various scenarios play out the way that they might. And so that's what my colleague and I were doing on the way out there. We were very quickly trying to get all of our equipment prepared, as well as going through medications being drawn up, drug doses, all that sort of stuff. And anyway, when we arrived, we found a very concerned EMS crew who was trying to care for a patient that immediately when we got in the ambulance, you could see that he was really struggling. He was having a heck of a difficult time breathing, and you could hear monitors beeping and alarms are going off. And there was a bit, as you can imagine, a bit of a chaotic handover that occurred. And the gist of it was that the team that had been caring for him, they weren't very worried about any other areas of concern with his exam other than his chest. So they hadn't found anything like in terms of long bone injuries or pelvis injuries or his head. It was all concern from his chest. And so I guess the Coles notes of the handover was that We think there's some asymmetrical movement of his chest, and we're wondering if he's got a pneumothorax, and we're getting ready to decompress his chest. But we heard you guys rolling up, and so we just held off until you got here. And so the first thing that we should probably talk about is anchoring bias. And this is the part of the case that's kind of anticlimactic because this is the thinking about thinking part. And so anchoring bias is when you can sometimes rely too heavily on the initial information that you're given. So the first diagnosis that's considered is the one that you kind of hang on to, and sometimes that can be at the expense of entertaining other possibilities. And so we were faced with a patient that was given to us as, here's somebody who fits this picture of having a pneumothorax, and they've certainly got the history that goes along with it and some exam findings that are concerning for it. And he looks really unwell. And so we started to examine him, and sure enough, we're kind of having a bit of a difficult time hearing breath sounds. Although interestingly, like his chest does seem to be symmetrically moving. That didn't seem to quite match with what we were given. And so that's kind of the first red flag, or the first piece of ammunition, I guess, that I use when I'm faced with the potential of anchoring bias, is like when something doesn't fit, or when you kind of get that, I don't know how to put this piece of information with the pattern that I've been given. That's the time where you kind of have to take a pause and say, is there another possibility? Like, have we excluded all other reasons for this to be taking place, and we still are comfortable with our first diagnosis? Is our differential diagnosis broad enough, or have we narrowed it down too far and we got to actually expand it again? And so given the clinical exam that this patient had, the other thing that was notable was that he was actually wheezing quite a bit. And that doesn't necessarily fit with somebody who has a collapsed lung. So these pieces aren't quite making sense in the exam. And so we decided at that point, even though the patient's oxygen saturations were quite precariously low, and he was looking like he was really struggling, he's taking really big deep breaths, and he's using all his accessory muscles to try and move air. And so we kind of took a pause at that point to go like, wait a second, is there something else that could be part of this situation? And the blood pressure at the time was reasonable, I remember. And so we kind of elected to hold off on intervening and doing anything in terms of trying to solve this pneumothorax, because two things. The first one was like, we didn't really understand if there was a pneumothorax, like which side of the chest. Is it one? Is it the other? Is it both that's been affected? And the other is like, are we potentially going to make this patient worse by doing a procedure that we're not 100% convinced is going to be high yield at this point? And to kind of maybe tap into my research brain for a little bit, one of the fascinating things about pneumothorax, especially in the context of young, very physiologically fit patients that end up having collapsed lungs, is that they can really sustain their blood pressures quite impressively just through the amount of preload that they can pull into their chest by having like big, deep sucking breaths and moving that air around and augmenting any kind of compression from having that extra air in the chest by actually just moving their chest more. The concerning part is when they get tired, or when they tire out and they kind of fail to compensate, and that compensatory mechanism stops working. That's kind of when they get into trouble. But that's usually like very, very late stages. And often those patients will present simply with hypoxemia. That'll be like their telltale sign, is they're just refractory hypoxic to adding extra oxygen, and they've got that ongoing feeling of dyspnea, and it doesn't seem to resolve with the treatments that you provide. And so being that this was a pretty young, fit guy and he had a reasonable blood pressure, we decided to take the time to try and investigate a little bit more. And so we were doing a bit more of exam. We were having the team that was there help us with switching over the monitoring equipment and putting our blood pressure cuff on, putting our leads and sat monitor on, getting ready to, despite the fact that we might have to intervene, still getting ready to move them in the direction of getting from the scene into the helicopter. And it's kind of interesting, like the next thing maybe to talk about is the availability bias. And so the idea that sometimes we judge the likelihoods of events based on how easily these examples come to mind. And the funny thing that I always like to think about is just how people think about shark attacks, and how they're sometimes scared to go in the water, scared to swim in the ocean because of shark attacks, when I've heard this statistic but haven't verified it, that like more injuries are caused by vending machines in a year than sharks. And so the availability bias in this case is that like you have somebody who has been handed over to you as riding a motorbike, hitting their chest at high speed on a tree, and is having chest problems. And in your head, that's pretty easy to put together with like, yeah, I've seen this like 10 times. The last group of people that I picked up from motorcycle accidents ended up having a pneumothorax. And so you're kind of having a bit of like an internal battle with your clinical decision making, your clinical reasoning, going like, this does make sense, and a reasonable practitioner has told me that this is what they're concerned about, and I also share those concerns, but yet something is still not quite right. And so at the time we had thought to bring along our portable ultrasound with us. And so interesting enough, like while my partner was getting ready for all the things that might come next, I can see that he's getting prepared with airway management equipment and chest decompression equipment and all the things that if the patient continues to get worse, will be ready to respond. I decided to throw the ultrasound probe on his chest and take a little look around. And one of the things that was interesting right away was that rather than seeing a lack of movement of the lungs that might indicate that there's air where it shouldn't be, that this pneumothorax exists. There's actually something that was more in keeping with fluid in his lungs. And so here's another piece of information that's just not making a lot of sense, and we're not too sure what to do with this. And we're kind of at the point now where I was confident to tell my colleague, I can't find anything on exam and I can't find anything on ultrasound that would indicate that we are doing the right thing for this patient by decompressing their chest. I really don't think that's the right move right now. Unfortunately, I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know what the right move is, but all we know right now is that this patient has smacked into a tree and has some chest findings that are indicative of some trauma and maybe even some edema or like pleural effusions in his chest. And so we decided at that point to start moving the patient to the helicopter, and keeping in mind, his blood pressure had been reasonable the last time we had checked. And then, of course, as these things go, like you get into the helicopter and your first blood pressure that comes back is like god awful. And so now, in retrospect, I realized that like the blood pressure cuff had been changed from the side that the ambulance was using, and then our cuff went on the opposite side. And so we weren't actually measuring the blood pressure on the same side as had been measured before. And this is only something in retrospect that we were able to pick up on. At the time, though, we're thinking now, okay, we're at this point where our patient is now starting to teeter over the edge of physically decompensating, and he's probably going to need intervention. We still haven't found what we were looking for. We're really searching for pneumothorax as a cause of the problem, and we cannot find it. And even on cursory exam with the ultrasound, looking for other things, any kind of hidden bleeding, like in his belly or his pelvis, we can't find anything there to explain his hypotension. And so this is the conundrum. This is the crux. And the next thing maybe to talk about is action bias. And it's one of the things that, especially for those of us working in the emergency aspect of healthcare, like whether that's in pre-hospital work or in the emergency departments or critical care units, it's that tendency that people want to favor action over inaction. It's really hard to just sit there and do nothing when everybody around you is kind of expecting that here you are, you're the person that we called to help, and you're going to help. And when you do nothing, it's kind of unsatisfying for people to see. And you feel that. You feel kind of people looking at you, and you feel the expectations, even if it's my colleague and I sitting there looking at each other in the back of the helicopter going, I feel like we should do something. And if we don't, we're also going to be showing up to a room of like 20 people expecting that we've done something, and we're going to feel like real clowns if we haven't. But we still had yet to find something that could put all these pieces of information together in a cohesive way that explained the constellation of symptoms that our patient was having. And this is something that I'm sure goes without saying, but when you have funny numbers on the monitor, like you got to check your patient. This is very rudimentary that everybody always says. And our patient's still sitting there like talking with us and saying he's having difficulty breathing, and clinically he had not changed since we had initially examined him. And so despite the fact that we were getting these repeatable, like very low blood pressures, we elected that we weren't going to do anything because we didn't know what we were trying to fix. We had yet to find a problem that we could conclusively solve without potentially having risk of causing further harm or further problems. And so that's a really difficult thing to sit with, the idea of the action bias and the idea that most oftentimes when we're called to help people, there's something that's very clearly wrong that we can fix and that we do, and then things get better. And it's very unsatisfying to just sit there with your thoughts going, I honestly don't know. Like I know that there's something wrong, but we don't know what it is yet. And the risk benefit part of that equation is not there. Like we are potentially making a decision to do something based on incomplete information. And sometimes you have to do that in this line of work, but there's always risks with taking those actions. And because of the fact that like we weren't sure that we were going to be providing anything of benefit, we decided to do nothing and took the patient to the level 1 trauma center where on initial exam, the portable chest X-ray that they did came back with an incredibly widened and atypical looking mediastinum, to which everybody's eyeballs kind of popped open and said, oh my goodness, like this is starting to make sense now. Like this key has unlocked a bit of a piece of the puzzle. Like this person probably has some sort of an aortic injury. And the conclusion to the case is that, in fact, this person had an injury that the vascular surgeon described as essentially being unsurvivable in most patients that he's come across in his career. And the patient ended up going for surgery and doing well and going home like within a week or so of their accident. Did not end up having pneumothoraces. And if we had put something into the chest to try and decompress a pneumothorax that wasn't there, we were undoubtedly going to make that patient worse. And in fact, despite the fact that he was super young and healthy and had just been injured like within the last 30 minutes before we got there, he had managed to develop pretty significant pulmonary effusions. And this is something that we had kind of noticed on the ultrasound, and it was certainly pattern matching with what we had found before, but we hadn't quite entertained that as a possibility just because of the fact that the patient was so early on in the course of their illness. But it certainly explained all the dyspnea and the hypoxia that the patient was experiencing. And for kind of a fun callback to the early part of the case, the blood pressure was explained by where the dissection was in the aortic root. And so the blood pressure cuff from the ambulance was on an arm that had no dissection flap. And then our blood pressure monitor had gone on where there was a dissection flap that transversed the subclavian artery. And so we were getting falsely low blood pressures the entire time that we were very nearly about to intervene and to act on. And so I guess to kind of like put it all together, the case for me really stands out as one where it wasn't a matter of our clinical skill or the equipment that we brought to the patient. It was really one that drove home how important it is to have good clinical reasoning and good decision making, doing the crew resource management part of it where you're entertaining ideas of all the other different people in the room to make sure that you're not missing any key pieces of information, bouncing ideas, off your colleagues and sharing your mental model of what's going on so everybody has the same amount of information that you do to try and help find those solutions. And thinking about those different cognitive biases, we're kind of fighting again on a case-by-case basis in emergency medicine and transport, where it's sometimes almost comical to a point, I think, when you have these cases that these red herrings kind of get thrown into, or some piece of information comes out that didn't really make sense, that you're just like, there it is. Now that makes sense. We've kind of been there and done that enough times that you can almost see these problems coming, where you walk into scenarios that people have fallen victim to the anchoring bias or the availability bias or premature closure of diagnosis. And they've done things that if they had just taken an extra minute to do a further exam or get some more history from the family or even some of the other providers that are in the room, sometimes those cases could have gone a very different direction. And we're quite fortunate in the air ambulance world that we get to show up with clear minds. We're not in the thick of caring for a patient, and you kind of have the outside 1,000-foot view, being able to walk into a room and see all the different things that are going on and then start from there versus somebody that's already having a lot of their bandwidth taken up by having to both care for the patient and think about all these different possibilities. So that's my interesting case. I wish it was something much more dramatic, or as people like to ask, something that was gross, but it was a very inconsequential case. In all honesty, like we sent a helicopter to pick somebody up, put them on a bed, and take them to the hospital. Like there was very little that we actually intervened with for that patient. But afterwards, talking with the staff at the hospital, they were in the same mindset where they're like, "Holy crap! Like, if you guys had done any of the things that would have potentially made sense at the time, given the information that you had, that probably would have been something that would have made this patient a lot sicker." And so, yeah, it's one that I look back on fondly as a memorable case.
Well, that is a crazy, crazy story. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that, Graham. And as soon as you gave the big reveal and told us what it was, I immediately thought, I'm so glad he didn't try to decompress that person's chest. That would have been terrible. But it is interesting. I think looking back on a lot of the interesting ones I've had, it's similar. It's not always the guts and the gore and those things, but it's a lot of those nuances of care that or the missed things that we come back later and realize were so valuable, so important. And you mentioned the word bias multiple times
Hmm.
in the story. Confirmation bias, action bias. You talked about anchoring bias. And so I wanted to kind of bring it back to a few of those things as well, because in that, I think that's being able to put aside things and perform a really thorough physical assessment is kind of a lost art in some ways. But at the same time, having the skills and the ability to understand what you're working with and to have a clear mind and clear action, I think is really, really valuable and important. And sharing stories like you just did, I think is very important as well, because it leads to a lot of understanding and connecting of the dots that I think don't often happen without sharing stories like this. And so, with all of that in mind, I was just curious because you're very focused on mentorship as well, and you're very focused on growth of others. And so, with some of the phrases that you just stated, some of the biases that you've mentioned and things, how do you go about helping people get past some of that? How do you go about mentoring others? And even in the flight world, there's so many nurses that join nursing to become flight nurses. Some, for whatever reasons, can't. Some of them go on to become a flight nurse and don't really know what they're getting into. They just know it looks cool and looks fun. So how do you mentor people to really draw from that breadth of good, solid assessment, listening to the patient, being aware of what's available to them? And then what do you find so rewarding about that aspect of nursing, that mentorship, leadership aspect that you're also involved in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's important to recognize that mentoring new nurses that are entering flight nursing is it is a structured process. There's kind of a stepwise approach to it, but it's also a very personal process for the learners based on what their goals are, what their learning needs are, what their background is, where they're coming from, and what they want to achieve, as well as it's personal from a standpoint of you have to take a real introspective look and have a very trusting relationship with a mentor and mentee so you can have difficult conversations. You can talk about hard things. You can talk about the areas that you need to improve upon in a frame of mind that's making all of us better versus going through repetitions to try and do it to the satisfaction of some arbitrary idea that has been created by a system or by a mentor. And so I think like early on, the focus for the mentorship relationship with new flight nurses or air medical crew would be that you want to focus on like the safety aspects, the environmental and logistical aspects, the crew resource management, those parts that until you actually do the job, like nobody really has those bits and pieces, and a lot of those are fundamental building blocks for kind of what comes next. I think that in a world like flight nursing or critical care in general, we're typically not having the very brand new medical learners that are coming to those places. And so they usually will come with various degrees of experience and skill already that doesn't necessarily need to get worked on in the early days of mentorship, but getting them comfortable with taking what they already know and putting that into the environment that they're now working within so that they can make sure that it's safe for them and safe for the patient. And I'm just trying to set them up for success in some of the like the pre-planning and decision making that maybe you don't necessarily have to do as much in the hospital. That's kind of the first part of mentorship. And then once you kind of get past the logistical side of it, or I don't want to call them the basics, but the initial part, I think the mentoring would shift more to more of a transmission of like the critical thinking, decision making, cognitive biases, that sort of thing. The model that you want people to be able to take what they know and then apply it in a way that's going to set them up for success. And part of that is guiding mentees through different scenarios, even just tabletop stuff, something as easy as talking about like different procedures or different scenarios that you might be faced with. These don't necessarily need to be like high fidelity scenarios. Even just sitting down to go through the steps of the so-called high acuity but low occurrence events, I think is really interesting just to hear different people's approaches. And there's always that old saying that like patients don't always read the medical textbooks, and that's so true, right? Where we kind of have the what happens in theory or what patients should look like when they present with a certain type of pathology in theory, but then being able to kind of add the aspect of critical thinking and good clinical reasoning to that so that at some point in the future, when the mentees are out in practice and those patients didn't read the textbook and they're presenting with various signs and symptoms that don't match with what's going on, or they've got these conflicting pieces of information, you really want to make sure that your relationship is one that's fostered the idea of being able to do that critical thinking and supporting that clinical reasoning so people can work through it on their own. And I think it's important to realize that these are going to be the next generation of clinicians, and one day they're going to be facing problems that we can't even anticipate yet. There's different ways that people are going to get hurt or get sick in the future that like we haven't even discovered, and those clinicians are going to have to be prepared to create novel solutions to those problems. And specifically to the flight environment or pre-hospital care environment, so often you end up finding patients that are in scenarios that are probably the most challenging part of their care, right? The pathophysiology or the changes to their anatomy that have occurred as a result of an illness or injury. That's almost the easy part. It's the difficult part where you've never come across something very strange, like a location for a patient, or like the way that you have to try and alter your treatment based on their environment or the conditions that you're faced with to make sure that you're doing something that's safe given these unpredictable parameters. And that's kind of my thoughts on the mentoring relationship. So while still sort of a stepwise approach, still taking the personal aspect of trying to find like where people's goals are and where they want to go and what they want to focus on, and making sure that they feel like they can have a safety net. And then as that progresses, as they get more comfortable, being able to kind of withdraw that to the point that they're able to function independently.
If anybody's listening to this and you're like, I'm not sure how to mentor this next generation of nurses, just rewind this back a little bit, listen to it one more time. Because again, when you're any new nurse coming into a new environment, yes, there's like the logistics, how to be safe, where stuff is. That's something that they have to kind of get acclimated to. And depending on the environment, that can take a couple of days, their experience, or it can take a couple of months. So there's some tailoring to each individual. And I really liked the way that you said, talking to them about like, what is your goal? What is it that you bring to the table as far as your experience, your understanding, your skills? What is your goal with this new role? What is it that you recognize as maybe something I already recognize I need to build this skill, or my understanding is lacking here? And then kind of tailoring your feedback to them based upon what you then see. And, hey, you're doing this really, really well. I see this, and this is something we're going to need to work on together. Let's do a scenario. Let's get a skills lab. Like, I think there's so many things that a really great mentor, when they come into your life, you realize, like, I would never have gotten to this level in my career had it not been for this person taking the time to ask me, like, where do you want to go from here? Like, what do you want to do? And really tailoring their feedback to me. So, again, we could just have you talk about that.
I was gonna say, I think what you touched on that like really resonated there was like the idea of deliberate practice, like doing scenarios or going through a skills lab. That's so important in that mentorship relationship because you have to have the trust with that relationship that somebody is able to feel like they can have self-reflection and you can guide them through like a debriefing after a call and come out of that without somebody feeling that they've not achieved a bar that's been set. Rather, they've found the areas where they would like to focus on improving. And then from that, you can take it to that deliberate practice part and say, okay, you know what, we're going to get the reps in now. Like if you want to build muscle, you got to go to the gym every day. Like if there's an area of practice that you've reflected upon and they're comfortable enough that they're able to highlight their areas that they want to get better at, then it makes it so much more powerful to be able to say, all right, like let's go to the mental gym and work out this one area until we really make sure that we build that up. And just as human beings, I think it's really tough sometimes to be a little bit vulnerable and to have that self-reflection. And in that light, it sometimes causes people to not focus. It's kind of like when somebody does a job interview and they say, tell me about a time where you did something that didn't go well. And then ultimately the response you get is something where somebody did something really well. And you're like, that's kind of not really the answer I was looking for. Like, I really want to know, like, where you reflected upon that you had a blind spot and how we're going to address that. And in like the mentor-mentee relationship, that's something that really only comes when you're able to both be open and honest about the debriefings and the reflection on practice. And from there, working out the mental muscle.
Yeah, I could not agree with that more. Well, not to call you out for the awesome work that you're doing, but one aspect that we have not covered yet is your volunteer work. So I know Michael in his bio just talked about some of the board work that you do, and I would like to bring up how you volunteered with BCEN, particularly your involvement in the CFRN item writing, the Exam Construction Review Committee, or ECRC as we like to call it around here. Over the past several years, it is our volunteers, it is the people that are the subject matter experts that we work alongside that truly make our organization so great. So thank you for just being one of those people. So I guess from your perspective, what has been the value of that commitment for you? And then I want to follow that up with what is some advice that you might give to someone who's considering volunteering, whether that be with BCN or at another nursing organization, et cetera. What would you say, like, hey, this is why I do it?
Well, first of all, like, thank you, Holly, and thank you, Michael, for keeping me in the fold and having me here still as part of BCN. It's been an incredible journey, and I've met so many amazing people in the profession through the connections that I've been able to make through the BCN. Volunteering, especially through the CFRN item writing and the exam construction review committee, it's been incredibly rewarding. And it's provided a unique opportunity to contribute to the integrity and the quality of the certification process for flight nursing. And it's also like kind of fun, honestly, to be able to see the exam that you put together is something that at the end of the day will help to determine whether somebody that might be sitting next to you the next day is going to be a credentialed flight nurse or not. That's kind of I don't know. That's for me like a really neat thing to be able to have a part in. And it's deepened my understanding of the exam development process, working with psychometricians. Like I still struggle to even say the word, but understanding how important their job is in making the exam something that is reproducible and it's applicable is so important to making sure that it's fair to everyone and it's valid when somebody completes the exam, and the credential, it means something because there's a ton of work that's gone into it and we've validated it in testing beforehand. One of the other knock-on effects, selfishly, is that I get to keep current in my practice, and one of the things that I often say is that we're sometimes committed to make the mistakes of our past if we don't learn and we don't expand our horizons and see other ways of doing things. And so just even coming to the meetings with people that are practicing in all different corners of the country and hearing the things that they are doing and the challenges and barriers that they might be facing, it's really kept me up to date with regards to different emerging practices and clinical standards. And it's really honestly a broad spectrum of information that in flight nursing we need to be apprised of. You never know on a daily basis whether you're going to be caring for a little baby with RSV or whether you're going to be caring for an adult with an aortic dissection. And that's a ton of information. That's a huge spectrum when you think about most people's careers that streamline into some much more clearly defined area of healthcare. Ours traverses every area of healthcare essentially. And the collaborative environment is really important. So working alongside with that diverse group of people and seeing how committed they are to the profession as well and how passionate they are about it, that fuels me. And it also to some extent like gives you a bit of a sense of stewardship, I think. Maybe that goes back to the thought of creating an exam that could determine whether or not somebody is able to get in the helicopter next to you the next day, but just making sure that it continues to represent the rigor and the respected standard that it has throughout the years, and thinking about people that have come before me who have been able to call themselves credentialed flight nurses. It makes you proud knowing that it's something that so many people have had a hand in, and it's very humbling as well. And I guess to answer the second part of your question, like for anyone that's considering volunteering with the BCN, I would say absolutely, of course, go for it. You know, it's so many different things to so many different people, and it can be something that if you're looking to grow professionally or expand your network or just give back to the field, the experience offers all of that and then some. And it's a chance to really contribute to something that is bigger than yourself, while also kind of honing the skills that benefit the patients that you ultimately see the next day. So don't underestimate the impact that you can have on the profession. You just kind of have to have the wherewithal to put your hand up and say yes, and decide to try something that you haven't done before. And I would say that the inspiration that you would gain from being part of the people that are volunteering with the BCN would really make you proud to be part of the profession. It's a very forward-thinking organization, and it's one that I'm very proud that I've been able to be part of for a number of years. So thank you, Michael and Holly.
Yeah, well, thank you for the huge positive plug, Graham.
Of
I
course.
feel very similar to the things that you said. I think when we have these meetings and we get to get around the table and talk, I always say like the nerd in me comes out a little bit because we're even those people from all over the country, it's really neat to be able to learn from each other and to have this opportunity to grow together and work on something that's going to make such a huge impact really around the world. I believe there's 26 countries represented with credential holders through BCEN. So it's a pretty awesome opportunity to make a big impact. So thank you for all the work that you've done in that. And speaking of big impact, I know we're running on time, so I'll be quick here. We always ask people, I get to ask people about some person or moment that has made a big impact on you or your career. You obviously told a great story about a patient with an aortic dissection, but whether it's a patient's encounter, whether it's a coworker, family member, whoever, is there somebody that's really made a big impact on you to be the person you are today, Graham?
Well, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of the founders of the current place that I work, Dr. Greg Powell. Unfortunately, he just passed away this past month, and so this is coming fresh off the back of a number of us in the organization mourning the loss of one of our essential founders of the company that we all work for now. And he's somebody that was a visionary of his time who really saw the disparity in healthcare and the fact that people who are living in rural areas were not getting the same level of care. They were not being afforded the same treatment that people who chose to live in more urban areas were able to receive. And because of that, He set forth in motion the chain of events and put a heck of a lot of his time and his family's time into the organization that we have today that now operates across essentially something the size of like Texas with critical care air ambulances that are serving areas of rural Canada that otherwise would not be receiving the care that they really truly deserve. And so for me, I would say that he may not have directly influenced my career in terms of like mentoring a relationship. While I did have many positive conversations with him, he ultimately was one of the people that created the system that I work within now. And to date, we've served tens of thousands of patients. And when you think about the knock-on effects of that in terms of not just lives saved, but people who have been able to have meaningful changes to their life that might otherwise not have been possible if it weren't for high quality care as well as the rapid transport. It's pretty impressive, honestly, that I get to be part of that. And so, yeah, I would say that that would be my person who I would name as the person having the greatest impact on my career to date.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I always enjoy hearing people's responses to that because it's certainly there are a lot of people that make an impact on who we are, and it's never just one, but it's always nice to hear when somebody really appreciates the time and effort that's gone into helping mold the medical community. It's certainly a great honor. I'm going to turn it over to Holly. She has some other questions to ask you.
Okay, Graham, I always say it's the fun part, but I think the whole interview is fun. But this is the quote unquote fun part. I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions. We're going to move through it lightning speed. Here we go. So, what would you be doing if you are not in your current role, career, role, job, anything like that? So, totally different. What would you do?
Oof, that's a tough one, man. I really enjoy the people that I get to work with and the work that I get to do. So, man, that'd be a really difficult one to step away from. But I've always been fascinated by architecture and by photography, and so maybe something in that realm of the world. And I also really enjoy being outside, so I could easily see myself moving to a career where maybe I did like guiding of fly fishing trips or backcountry ski tours or canoe trips, something like that. It'd be hard to name just one, honestly. I don't know.
The world is your oyster in these rapid fire questions. But I was like,
Sweet.
maybe he could be like one of those guided architecture people who takes the pictures as well as like, oh, look, we're going to stop here on this island and go see the animals and the forestry. I mean, maybe there's a way to roll it all into one, but either way, we get to
If
know
you
you a
find it,
little
let me
bit more.
know.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it out on LinkedIn. You probably have like six people contacting you tomorrow. I'm not gonna do that, but I might.
I was
Okay.
really expecting him to see he wanted to be the next Bob Ross. I'm just shocked that was the answer.
I'll start growing my hair out now.
Yeah, that's a commitment. So, all right. We also have some favorites. So here we go. Do you have a favorite book or a quote that really inspires you?
Ooh, another good question. You know what? I think favorite quote, and this probably will appeal to all of us that are working in pre-hospital and kind of emergency care. It's from Hunter S. Thompson, and it's when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And I feel like that really embodies like what we end up doing on a daily basis, where everybody knows that moment, right? Where something very abnormal happens, and then like you're just making yourself a sandwich, like people respond to it like complete and absolute professionals and come up with these novel solutions to things that you could never have predicted or you've never experienced before. Everybody knows like that one nurse in the emergency department where the person that comes in and they've, I don't know, like broken all of their extremities and they need an IV, and that nurse comes over and like puts it into like their upper part of their chest or something like that. And you're like, wow, that's a true professional. That was a totally weird scenario, but they handled that as if they were literally going to the fridge and making themselves a sandwich. Like that was nothing to them. Or in the EMS world where you're faced with these clinical scenarios where like not only is the person having a heart attack, but they've also managed to like trap themselves in like some incredibly like absurd environment where like you can barely access them. And then you have the person that comes along and is like, yeah, no problem. Like here, like I'll just pass the ECG electrodes like through this tiny hole to them and like tell them how to put the electrodes on. And while everybody else is like getting geared up to like find a way to extricate the patient out, like they're going to do their 12 lead for themselves. And you're like, huh, yeah, why not? Like I never thought of that.
Yeah. It's amazing when you get just a couple of people in the room and you all have like different MacGyver ideas about how to solve the problem. And then you realize, like, gosh, I'm so glad I work with all of these people who can take something that's just outlandish and weird, to your point, and be like, oh, we have 6 ways we can solve this problem. Ah, I love it. I love it. Okay. Do you have a favorite song or a musical artist or something that you would recommend to us to check out? Go.
I've actually never listened to the song, but as of yesterday, I learned that apparently a song called Pink Pony Club is actually like more accurate in terms of cadence for doing CPR. And so if you can imagine like three grown 6 foot tall dudes in the back of a helicopter singing Pink Pony Club, yeah, apparently that's a thing. So not my favorite song as of yet, but I feel like I need to listen to it a couple times in case the clinical scenario reveals itself again.
The fact that you're recommending it, I have listened to the song.
How does it
Um,
go?
no, not doing it. Um, not gonna trick me into that one. I've got to save my singing voice for my Ariata later. But no, the idea is that when I started in the emergency department, they'd be like, "Oh, you got to keep the cadence of staying alive," which again, that was kind of a throwback then. So now, I mean, we do have to find new music for our millennial, Gen X, Gen Z, all of the generations. We're gonna have to update our songs. So I'm glad that you're on the cutting edge of that, Graham. I'm just
Well, I
saying,
hope we all learned something today.
yeah, I feel like this podcast is going to be teaching for a lot of reasons, but please, I hope everyone held on to this part because
I
this
think
will
I
be
think you
helpful.
just explained the essence of when the weird turned pro. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, that was
Oh,
definitely one of those moments. Yeah.
that's good. Okay. This last one, honestly, I like this question always because I feel like as nurses, we don't generally do a great job with this, but some of us do intentional work. So, what is your self-care go-to or way that helps you reset?
Oh, very important. Yeah, absolutely. I think just getting outside for me it's my happy place. It's one of the ways that like I really enjoy resetting. And so in the summertime, I really enjoy going fly fishing. And even if you don't catch any fish, like worst case scenario, you've had a really enjoyable hike outside along a stream bed somewhere out in the woods. In the wintertime, I really enjoy backcountry skiing and getting out and being able to go explore places that other people probably haven't been to for months. And it's quiet. It's someplace that you can really be reflective and kind of be alone with your thoughts. But at the same time, like I also really enjoy sharing that experience with other people and being outside with friends and family. And that's also another really important way to reset and thinking about self-care, honestly, is just when you're not okay, like letting other people know that you're not okay, and they'll be there to back you up, just like you can for them at some point when they need it. And the medium of nature and being outside for me is just one of those really comfortable places where I like to go and reset.
Awesome. I love a good reset. So, all right. If our audience would like to follow you online, what social media platforms could they do that on?
I honestly I'm more of a taker than a giver when it comes to social media. So I'm not really that active on social media, but through my LinkedIn, that's probably the best way to get a hold of me if you have any questions or if you have an idea that you'd like to share. I'm always open to new ways of practice and new things that are evolving in the emergency and pre-hospital space. So yeah, I think the best one would be LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I will include that on our blog. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been great having you. It's really nice chatting with you, and I always enjoy having a conversation with somebody that's really passionate about what they do. And wants to grow the profession, grow themselves as a profession. And I think you exemplify both of those. And we appreciate you being on here with us and sharing that passion with us. And, great stories, great conversation. And I hope we can continue to interact with you in other ways and maybe see you at a conference in the future or something like that. Would certainly love that. But really enjoyed the conversation today. Again, thank you so much for being on here with us.
Well, I want to take this time to thank Graham for joining us for this episode of BCN and Friends. Graham, thank you for sharing your expertise, your experiences, along with your passion for mentoring the next generation. You lead by example, not only in the clinical setting, but also in the way that you serve and volunteer your time to further the nursing profession. We truly appreciate you and all that you are doing. And to all of our listeners, stay tuned as we bring new, insightful episodes of BCN and Friends. If you have a suggestion for an episode, we'd love to hear from you. So you can send us a message to bcn@bcn.org. I'm Holly Briggs, here with Michael Dexter, and on behalf of the entire BCN team, we thank and celebrate you for all that you're doing as professional nurses across the emergency spectrum. Until next time, we are out.